Imagine waking up one day in medieval times, meaning no phone, no clean water, no modern medicine. Within hours, you're hungry, filthy, and battling infections we don't even think about today. Work is brutal, punishments are terrifying, and even a simple scratch could be deadly. Oh, and if you want to sleep, good luck fighting off rats, fleas, and all kinds of pests. This is just a glimpse of how harsh life was back then. Could you survive 24 hours in medieval times? Let's find out. Number 1. No modern comforts. Life in medieval times was a never-ending test of endurance. Even the richest people, lords and nobles, slept on what they called soft beds, but compared to today's mattresses, they were glorified sacks of discomfort. Stuffed with straw, horsehair, or feathers, these mattresses flattened into lumpy, bug-infested pillows in no time. And for those not of noble status, it was even worse. A pile of straw on the floor, crawling with fleas, lice, and whatever else had made itself a home in there. Blankets in the winter were a luxury, and of course, no fans in the summer. Just the cold, hard reality of medieval life. If you were fortunate enough to have a pillow, it was likely filled with straw or even rags, offering about as much support and comfort as a literal sack of potatoes. And forget about central heating. Most homes had a single fireplace, but early medieval houses didn't even have a chimney most of the time, so the smoke would accumulate inside the house, and you can imagine how uncomfortable and dangerous that would be. Candles were expensive, so many people relied on dim oil lamps or rushlights, which is a type of candle or miniature torch made by soaking the dried pith of a rush plant in fat or grease. A single 30-inch rushlight could burn for about an hour. In today's world, when we feel exhausted after a day of work, we tend to relax and have hundreds of entertainment options, some of which you're probably watching this video on. But those in medieval times obviously didn't have these options. Sure, there were books, but most of the people didn't know how to read outside of the aristocracy, and theaters didn't exist. Music came from the occasional traveling performer, but most of them had no access to instruments. Number 2. Brutal living conditions. Even some of the least desirable living conditions of today's world are nowhere near as brutal as it was back then. There was no plumbing, no sewage system, and definitely no clean streets. Bodily waste, both human and animal, were simply dumped straight into the roads, turning entire towns into disease-ridden swamps of filth. So if you're skeeved out by the smell of just one person forgetting to flush the toilet, imagine how bad the stench must have been when the waste and garbage were literally everywhere. I can tell you it didn't smell like roses. And if you lived in a city, you walked through mud mixed with rotten food, animal carcasses, and raw sewage every day. Try not to slip. Inside houses wasn't much better. Floors were usually just packed dirt, sometimes covered with straw, that absorbed everything from spilled food to bodily fluids, and of course never got cleaned. Rats and insects were everywhere, feasting on whatever scraps they could find, and possibly you if you weren't paying attention. And if you lived in the countryside, you might share your home with livestock for warmth, meaning you slept just a few feet away from pigs, chickens, or even cows. And then there was the food. Fresh fruits and vegetables were in fact rare, and most people lived on bread, porridge, and salted meat if they could afford meat at all. Food preservation wasn't what it is today, and led to spoiled or moldy food very often. Weevils in your flour? Normal. Maggots in your meat? Just scrape them off and eat it anyway. If you somehow think you're tough enough to survive all this, then wait till you hear how bad consuming rotten food and dirty water is. Number 3. Dangerous food and water. Remember the last time you had moldy food in your fridge? Well, in medieval times, every meal was a gamble. These days we freak out over one tiny speck of mold on bread. Try eating food that's been sitting in a wooden barrel for months, packed with so much salt it was barely edible. Even then, rot was common. People just scraped off the mold and ate it anyway. I mean, it's not exactly like they had food delivery services ready to bring you a piping hot meal. Bread was the staple food, and it wasn't safe either. Rye bread often contained ergot fungus, a toxin that causes hallucinations, seizures, and can even be deadly. Sometimes entire villages went mad, thinking they were all possessed, all because they ate some bad bread. And water, especially by today's standards, undrinkable. Wells and rivers were contaminated with human and animal waste, dead bodies, and rotting garbage. In case you're wondering why they didn't just boil it, firewood was scarce and expensive for the average person. Boiling water took time, effort, and resources most people didn't have. Instead, they drank weak ale, which had low alcohol content and acted as a natural preservative, making it a safer option than drinking water. It was the alternative for water from morning till night, even for children. Don't tell that to an alcoholic. But if you wanted to know more about medieval drinking habits, we have a video on that in the channel, so check out the link in the description below after you're done watching this video. Number 4. Deadly diseases and no medicine. Practically no sanitary conditions meant that diseases were all too common. Plague, smallpox, dysentery, it was a non-stop battle against diseases that killed in the millions. The Black Plague alone wiped out as much as 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. That's over 50 million people gone, their bodies piled into mass graves because there were too many to bury properly. And that was just one disease. Got an itty-bitty cut? It could in fact kill you in those times. Infections were rampant, and with no antibiotics, even superficial cuts could turn septic. Surgery was more like butchery, and performed without anesthesia, often with dirty and/or rusted tools. Tetanus, anybody? Oh, and did you think you could get medicine? Nuh-uh. All you got was mixtures of herbs, minerals, and animal products, and many other remedies that were based on pure superstition rather than science. Some treatments were even worse than the disease the patient already had, like bloodletting, where doctors would drain blood to bring the disease out of the body, supposedly. And many of the herbs used in medieval medicine were contaminated or mixed with toxic substances, which did nothing but make the patient sicker. But even if you were hardy enough to not be killed by disease, what about the law? Could you survive the punishments they had? What if your entire life was controlled by a social system that you could never hope to escape from? This video is about to get a whole lot more interesting, so make sure you press the like button and subscribe to the channel for more like this. Now let me make you feel even more grateful for the times we live in. Number 5. Harsh laws and punishment. If you thought paying a speeding ticket sucked, justice in the medieval world was swift, brutal, and often completely unfair compared to modern standards. Did you get caught stealing bread because you were hungry? You could end up losing a hand. Gossip about the wrong person? You might find yourself locked in the wooden stocks, left in the town square for days while people threw rotten food at you. But for the more serious crimes, the punishments were horrifying. Hanging, beheading, and burning at the stake were common. To give you an idea, in 1531, a cook named Richard Roos perhaps met the most awful end in England for simply poisoning a meal. He was working for the Bishop of Rochester and was accused of poisoning a pot of porridge, killing 2 people and sickening many others. Poisoning was a form of treason at the time, and this poor guy was literally boiled alive in Smithfield as punishment. This brutal execution was one of only a few recorded instances of boiling as a legal penalty in England. Thankfully, the law was repealed in 1547. To get even more brutal, hanging, drawing, and quartering were other infamous punishments of the time, and perhaps the most famous person to suffer that was William Wallace, the Scottish rebel who met a similar fate in 1305. After partial hanging, he was disemboweled, beheaded, and chopped into 4 pieces. His limbs were displayed across Scotland as a warning to rebels. Yikes! And justice? It was a joke. Trials weren't about evidence, but ordeals. In one such case, a man in the 12th century had to carry a red-hot iron to prove his innocence. If his wounds healed cleanly, he was free. If not, guilty. You can probably imagine how that went. But punishments weren't the only nightmare. Imagine being born into a system where your entire future was decided at birth, with absolutely no way out. Number 6. Extreme social hierarchy. Do you believe in chasing your dreams or working your way up in society? Well, in medieval times, that did not exist. Where you were born was where you stayed. At the top, kings and nobles enjoyed living in luxury, but the remaining 90% were peasants at the bottom who worked endlessly just to survive. Peasants weren't just poor, they were owned. Many of them were serfs, unfree peasants legally bound to the land, forced to work for a lord who could tax them into starvation. You want to submit a 2 weeks notice? That wasn't happening. It was illegal under feudal obligations. Even the much fantasized knights and merchants had limits. No matter how much money a merchant made, they'd never be considered a noble. And if you were a woman, good luck. Most had zero rights, couldn't own property, and were forced into marriages they had no say in. And don't even think about trying to break free. Laws enforce this system with brutal punishments. Just speaking out against your lord could get you executed. Number 7. Superstition and fear. Lack of science and modern equipment meant no one knew the real cause of pretty much anything. Belief in witches, demons, and curses was commonplace, and the church reinforced all of it. Had a bad harvest? Clearly the work of witchcraft. Someone suffering strange physical or mental illness? It must be demonic possession. To avoid divine punishment, some people engaged in bizarre rituals like self-flagellation, which was whipping themselves bloody in public in a show of repentance. And while accusations today might hurt your reputation, back then, it could be deadly. Thousands of people, mostly women, were burned at the stake or hanged for being witches. In some places, simply owning a black cat was enough to get you taken out. Even comets and eclipses were seen as omens of doom, and when the doctors developed medicines based on astrology and superstition, the cures were generally as dangerous as the diseases themselves. Number 8. No rights, no freedom. If you weren't born into nobility, you had basically no rights. Peasants couldn't vote, own land, or even choose their jobs. They worked for a lord, paying heavy taxes while barely surviving. Basically small-scale fascism. Most women were forced into marriage, and their husbands controlled everything, even their legal identity. Women were not seen as people, but as their father or husband's property. And you know how in most places you're allowed to say whatever you want about politicians? Well, speaking out against the king or the church could get you executed for treason or heresy, and we know how bad those punishments were, so people generally avoided any sort of confrontation with those in power. Medieval life was strict, controlled, and viciously unforgiving. But somehow, people still survived. So the real question is, could you? Let us know in the comments below how long you think you'd last in medieval times. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.